Good morning and welcome to today's Institute for Government event on the government's newly published English Devolution white paper, Power and Partnership Foundations for Growth, which was launched just this Monday. A little bit delayed, but better late than never. My name is Akash Pown. I'm a Programme Director for Devolution here at the IFG in London. And I'm delighted to be joined by three of my excellent IFG colleagues for a conversation about what's in the white paper, what isn't, that we might have expected or hoped to see in there, what the implications might be for England of the implementation of this quite ambitious agenda, and what challenges may lie ahead for the government as it seeks to make progress with implementation. So we've got an hour for what I hope will be a very rich conversation. I know we've got a big I'm sure, very interested online audience as well. So I look forward to contributions from you all as well. Joining us on the panel, as I say, it's an all IFG cast today. First of all, very pleased to be joined by Tom Pope, who is Deputy Chief Economist at the IFG. Tom, hi.
Hi, Akash.
Great to have you with us. And then next up, Rebecca McKee, who is Senior Researcher on the Public Finance team, works closely with Tom on all things local growth policy, and always seems to be doing about 8 other projects as well. Rebecca, welcome.
Morning, Akash. Great to be here.
Hi, morning. And then last but not least, very pleased to have with us Matthew Fright, who is Senior Researcher on the Devolution team, Team Devo, working closely with me, also lead author of our recent report on how the government should complete the map of English devolution, which I know is going to be one of the themes of the conversation today. Matthew, how's it going?
Very good, Akash. Morning.
Morning to you all. Great. So I'll be, for the first part of the webinar, putting some questions to my colleagues. We'll be talking through some of the central themes of the white paper, as you'd expect. And then I'm sure we're going to have, I can already see we do have some lots of questions coming through from the online audience. You should be able to submit those via Slido, anyone watching live. And you can vote for other people's questions as well. So I can get a sense of what the crowd would like us to discuss. So, as I say, the white paper was launched on Monday. Angela Rayner was up in Leeds, not speaking directly to Parliament, to the annoyance perhaps of the speaker, but she was up in Leeds giving a speech on the white paper to an audience of Metro mayors, local leaders, business folk, and many others, including our own Tom Pope. So, Tom, before we dive into the detail of the proposals, what did you make of the launch? What was the mood like in the room?
Thanks, Akash. I think the mood was pretty positive, and maybe that's not that surprising. The government can curate quite carefully who comes to these things, but there was very good representation. Pretty much all of the Metro mayors were there, quite a few councillors as well, and then sort of wider community, as you say. Certainly from the mayor's side, they all seemed very happy. From the kind of most established mayors in Andy Burnham to some of the newer mayors, they all seemed to be pretty pleased with what was here, to view it as a statement of their role in delivering the government's missions, and that it's actually providing quite a lot of new power to help them do that. I think there's perhaps a broader feeling in the room that what's actually really new and radical here. Lots of what has been announced was perhaps a continuation of what the last government was doing, and also has been quite heavily trailed in previous Labour announcements. There was another document called Power and Partnership published back in April before the local elections that actually committed to quite a lot of the things in the white paper that fleshed things out. So I think broadly positive, but perhaps a feeling that there wasn't anything massively new. But I do think that reflects really the fact that so much of it has been in the pipeline for some time.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've been constantly struck, haven't we? I think eternally by the amount of continuity from the Conservative agenda. I mean, compared to when previous governments have come in afresh and maybe really started to reinvent the wheel. So I think that's something we'd probably welcome as sensible policy making. But there are, I think, some quite big departures as well that we'll certainly get into over the course of this event. I, meanwhile, was, of course, up in Edinburgh for a poorly planned or poorly timed trip, so missed all the excitement of the launch. Rebecca, you were down in Westminster watching all this unfold on Monday and Tuesday. How do you feel the white paper's landed? Has the government got the coverage and the response it was hoping for, do you think?
Yeah, thank you, Akash. I mean, the first thing to note for anyone that maybe cares about these things, it's definitely lacking a sort of catchy phrase that the Levelling Up white paper had. And I think power and partnerships, or even devolution, revolution, which only works in certain accents, doesn't quite sort of have that cut through. But despite that, for anyone that cares about that, I actually think that the main story of local government reorganisation has had a big splash. That has been like the main thing that has really, I suppose, like cut through or been the thing that has been the main headline. And that is a big reorganisation, as we'll come to later on. That is quite a lot more radical. And there's been a lot of noise, both positive and negative, about that. I had a look at the House of Commons debate on this, and that's quite a good way of looking at what some of the debates might be across the country. So there's concerns from some MPs about sort of the overreach of strategic authorities or potentially hollowing out of local authorities, as well as concerns that unitarisation moves some of the decision-making further away from local communities. But on the other hand, there are other MPs that have actually been very warmly welcoming of this. And I guess Westminster adjacent, or Westminster people, I guess, like us and other think tanks, have also been quite warmly welcoming of this. Not just what's in the white paper, the diagnosis of the problems and the understanding of like what the context is now, and then what you need to do in order to make that work. I think has landed quite well. But beyond the big splashy reorganisation headline, I think the other stuff is a bit technical. It's a bit like trying to get things in order and getting that cut through, or the splashy headlines, that kind of stuff, beyond people like us and others joining this webinar that care about, I think is quite difficult. But yeah, among those of us who pay attention, I think especially the recognition of the importance of good governance and scrutiny, I think that's been really welcome. And that is really going to be key to the implementation of this and making sure it all works. There's, of course, been some comments as well that it hasn't gone far enough, and that actually devolution in England is a completely different thing from devolution in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And I think there's that thing that needs to be reconciled on whether we really mean something more like decentralisation or kind of linguistic or ideological differences. But, you know, in England, it's a really different model and within the context. And I think that where people just wanted clarity and consistency, I think that has landed quite well.
Yes, absolutely. I think we were speaking about this yesterday briefly, weren't we? This debate about whether using the same word devolution for what's happening in England as what has happened in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland is even appropriate. I mean, I think we are fairly comfortable saying, yes, the powers on offer, the model is far more limited for sure than the devolved nations, but it's somewhere in the same ballpark. There may be just a lot less developed settlements in England, but yeah, one can get probably a bit sidetracked by the definitions of things. Because meanwhile, yeah, there's, as you say, there's a lot of quite, I think we would see important reforms in there, maybe in some senses technical, as you say, not kind of headline grabbing, but really important stuff nonetheless. And so as we do now move into discussing that detail, I mean, I think, you know, what we've also been pleased to see is the degree of alignment with what the IFG's previously set out as the key problems to fix in the governance of England. So before the election back in May, well, the four of us and another colleague, Bryony Allen, we wrote a report called A New Deal for England, and in which we set out a number of proposals, 30 in total, I think, for what we thought the next government should do to complete the job of devolution. That was our phrase. And what we argued was there should be action on 5 dimensions. So extending devolution to all parts of the country, completing the map, deepening the powers of existing metro mayors, devolved institutions, improving the funding system, reforming governance and accountability, and also putting devolution onto a firmer constitutional footing. And I think we can see action on all those fronts in the white paper. So Matthew, I'd like to start with you. Tell us about the government's proposals as we now understand them for extending devolution into those devolution deserts, the 50% of the country left out thus far. Do we now have a clearer sense of what that process is going to look like, and also maybe importantly, what the final map of devolution across England is going to look like?
Well, the government laid out really clear ambitions to complete the English devolution map and extend devolution to all those remaining parts of England that don't have them, as you say, so-called devolution deserts. What the government didn't do was produce a finalised map. In part, ministers have been keen to emphasise that they're filling an almost quasi-judicial role where they have to sit above the local discussions and adjudicate on what the best local map looks like. But they've also been really keen to emphasise the need for partnership working on this too, so there is very much locally led discussions on what powers and what a local geography looks like. What the government did do, as you say, was made it much clearer what the process is going to be for local authorities for how they go about completing the map. And what they did is outline a few sort of rules and criteria that the local areas are going to need to think through, such as scale. They've been clear they want a preference for more than 1.5 million people for a future geography, alignment where possible with the underlying economic geography in an area, the desire to not leave any devolution islands, and also ensuring that there's local identity and other factors too. Now, this is something we really welcome, and indeed we made a case for similar criteria in our report over the summer, completing the map. But from these rules, I think we start to get a bit of a clearer idea of how local leaders might start to come together and in conjunction with government help to fill in that map.
Yeah, thanks. And I mean, what do you think? I know the government didn't really specify where it's going to start, but what do you think are the most interesting places to watch as likely candidates for the next wave of devolution agreements?
Well, I think it's not just a question of where, but there's also a question of when too. The government has launched a new devolution priority programme and said that it will announce in January the areas that are going to be ready for mayoral elections in May 2026. Now, based on earlier announcements, we might get some sense of what we might be seeing there. So Angela Rayner at Labour Party conference made the case for wanting to complete the devolution map in the north, so keep an eye on Cheshire. Keep an eye on Cumbria, though obviously the population is below the 1.5 million threshold, so we'll need to see how that kind of plays out. Also keep an eye on Lancashire, where although there is a non-mayoral deal in operation, there's been a vibrant discussion on whether the area is going to seek mayoral powers. Also keep an eye out for areas such as Norfolk and Suffolk, which had previously pitched for mayoral powers to be conferred on their leader of the council. Now, the government's been keen that they don't want to have what was previously known as county deals. So it's likely that these areas will have gone back to the drawing board, revisited these discussions, and may be coming forward with new suggestions. But I think what I'm certainly keeping an eye out for is the southeast. There's obviously 2 non-mayoral deals in areas like Surrey and Buckinghamshire, but there's much further work needed. And we know there are some sort of slightly deals that are closer to the line in areas like Essex and Kent, where discussions were developing really strongly before the election. So we'll have to see what degree local government reorganisation might have an effect on the timings there. But those are the areas I'm keeping an eye out for.
Yeah, really interesting places or developments in many places across the country. We're going to come properly onto questions later, but we've actually just had a question in that I might as well put to you now as it relates to what you were just talking about. So this is from Philip Berman via Blue Sky. And he asks about a place close to your heart, I know, Matthew, Sussex. His question is, he's very interested to understand how East and West Sussex might partner with Brighton with such different cultural identities, political makeups? Will they be forced to work together for economies of scale and the growth agenda? What's your thoughts on the Sussex situation specifically?
I think it's a valid question because for many areas where there haven't been vibrant devolution discussions to date, it's quite difficult to imagine how these areas could come together. However, if we look at other parts of the map that have already got mayors or have got mayors in train, I think there's a route forward. And it kind of draws on your work, Akash, from after the devolution deal about how do you come up with a vision for an area. So if you look at somewhere like, say, in the East Midlands, you have a combination of both urban and rural areas that come together under one mayoralty. Equally, if you look at somewhere like Hull and East Yorkshire, we had the leader of East Yorkshire riding on our panel at Conservative Party conference, and she said that she literally went into the office of the leader of Hull and said, look, to work in, to get to Hull, you have to go through my county. To find a job, I need to go to your council. So we have a strategic relationship. We are intimately related, and we need to make sure that we get the powers that operate over that kind of scale. So I think that when local leaders take a step back and go, well, actually, and in Sussex particularly, have we got interconnected housing markets? Are people commuting from one area to another? The underlying economic geography provides a little bit of an indicator, but there are other dimensions. You need that you need political support, and you need to respect the identity too. And I think the very final thing I'll say on it is that I think there's always a concern that if you have slightly different political parties, that means they won't get on. I think if you have a look at what happens in the West Midlands, where typically the board has been split between Labour and Conservatives, and yet there's been good progress there, or in Tees Valley, indeed, where you have a Conservative mayor, but often Labour-led councils who are on the same board and they're having to collectively decide things, I think that shows that actually we're probably placing too much of an emphasis on politics and not taking a step back and saying, actually, how can these areas come together and forge a vision of what the place could look like and use that to really determine politics going forward?
Yeah, no, thanks very much. Okay, so moving on from the widening devolution agenda to the deepening devolution aspects of paper. So, Tom, the white paper sets out I think some quite interesting new powers that are going to be on the agenda or on the menu for places to take from Whitehall. There's also a new devolution framework, which is going to be put into legislation for the first time. Tell us about that. What do you think are the most important powers that places are now going to be offered?
I think if you look at the set of powers available, I think what's really important here is it's as much about where is going to get those powers as sort of how extensive those powers are. So there were the devolution trailblazer deals agreed with Greater Manchester and the West Midlands under the last government that agreed much more flexibility over funding, additional powers in areas like skills and transport, for example, the opportunity to have a greater say in local rail networks and things like that. And the key centerpiece of that was an integrated settlement, so more a sort of single pot of funding set across a series of different areas that they'll have more control over. I think the biggest thing that the white paper does in terms of powers, rather than providing entirely new powers, is to extend that to a much greater set of authorities. So lots of the mayoralties that have been around for a while, for example, in West and South Yorkshire, in Liverpool and in actually the northeast as well, are going to get access to that set of powers with a view to more places reaching that third tier of the framework, so-called established strategic authorities over time. And what that means for those places is that they will have, I think for the first time really, meaningful flexibility in how they spend local transport funding, adult skills funding, those for over 19 or from 19 and over, some affordable housing and retrofits, for example, with additional say over things like local skills improvement plans to determine what skills are required in an area, the rail network and other aspects of transport as well. So I think that's a really substantial set of things. I suppose the other big thing on offer. And the new thing, if you like, is this new duty to develop a spatial development strategy, which will underpin the local housing plans that will determine how much housing is built effectively in the different local authorities, and significantly that mayors will get so-called call-in powers. So when there are some decisions of strategic importance around bits of infrastructure where they feel like the planning system is being obstructive, like the mayor in London currently can do in some circumstances, they can call that in. So I think that those are the big sort of new chunky powers on offer. There are also new powers for those places that aren't yet at that third tier. So just more standard mayoral deals, including more funding flexibility, and some of those powers that I've already mentioned.
Yeah, no, great. And I mean, you've given a sense of this already, but I mean, in your view then, is this the right set of powers to be devolved to this city regional scale, given the government's, essentially the objective of this whole agenda from the government's perspective is that mayors can help to deliver on the government's missions and particularly growth, I think. So yeah, is this the right package, and what's missing?
Yeah, so it's certainly, I mean, the set of powers and sort of the broad buckets of powers that we're talking about, transport, skills, funding, innovation, and so on, excuse me, are the right set of powers. That is the right set of powers, excuse me. And this is certainly what we've written in our work, that there's a really good case that mayors sitting at that strategic economic level, that coherent economic geography, are well placed to make a set of interrelated and connected decisions that sort of in some reach a kind of local economic strategy or regional strategy, the type of strategy that's very hard to do at a more local level where a local authority is not big enough to cover that geography, but also is very hard to do from Whitehall, that both doesn't have that local knowledge of the place and also is not very well equipped to coordinate some of those mechanisms. So I think it's broadly the right set of powers. I think there are then some areas where you might have liked it to have gone further to really equip mayors to deliver on that growth mission. For example, I think on innovation, there's some interesting discussions about new local innovation funds that might be agreed at the spending review, but compared to some of the other areas, there's not going to be as much control for mayors over that funding. There are also various partnership relationships with arm's length bodies like Homes England, and it'll be interesting to see whether those are genuine partnerships or just kind of a nominal relationship. But I think on growth, which has really been the MO for mayors since they've been set up, it was the rationale that George Osborne used, the rationale that Michael Gove used, and it's very much the rationale the government is using. I think what is quite interesting is what's the potential for mayors in other missions as well. Now, only one of the 5 missions is growth, and there are several missions related to the NHS and crime and so on. And I think there are some interesting sort of relatively tentative steps, but sort of a foray for mayors in this white paper into kind of public services devolution a bit more substantively. So that includes additional roles related to NHS integrated care boards, a role for mayors at least to be consulted on the appointment of the leaders of those boards, for example, additional public health duties in some places, a view that the role of Police and Crime Commission should be integrated with the mayor wherever boundaries align, and so on. There aren't that many really firm powers in the kind of public service space, but I think this is really the first time, probably since the deal that Greater Manchester did in 2015, where public service devolution to mayors feels like it's much more on the agenda.
Yeah, no, absolutely, because it's true, isn't it? I mean, if you go back to the debate at that time when this was George Osborne leading the charge, his devolution revolution, as you said, Rebecca, you have to pronounce it devolution revolution to make that make sense. But it was public services and health, I think, in particular, was seen as one of the core pillars of that agenda, and it did drop off in most places. And the focus became a lot narrower on growth and infrastructure and job creation and so on. So I think it's very interesting. I mean, there's the energy mission as well, of course, where I think the mayors are going to be given a greater role again. I think once again, perhaps it's more in the sort of partnership rather than firm control of the system kind of space. But that is quite an interesting one to watch, as well as a role in retrofit and other kind of net zero related functions. Tom, did you want to come back in on that?
Yeah, just on that retrofit point, there's one thing that didn't look like a very big change, but I think actually was quite important, which is that initially, when the integrated settlements, this flexible funding was announced, the retrofits pillar of funding was explicitly just going to be a pilot. And I think there was quite a lot of fear that it would be something that was tried once and then slowly retracted, whereas the devolution white paper has explicitly made that more permanent, which I think actually, looks quite quiet, looks like a continuation of the last government, but it is a commitment, an increased commitment to devolution in that space.
Yeah, that was an interesting change. I agree. Okay, moving on, and I can see we've already got some 40 odd questions coming through. So I'm just, apologies in advance. We're never going to take all of those, but let's try and rattle through a few more questions from me, and then we'll go to the audience. So Rebecca, you've been working on a project over the past couple of months, alongside your travels around the world, as usual, looking at how mayoral combined authorities take decisions. And I think we've previously made the argument that metro mayors on some of the key sort of strategic decisions are hamstrung by decision-making requirements. There are some interesting ideas on that front in terms of planned reforms in the white paper. Tell us about those and what you think of the ideas.
Yeah, so it's quite a big change, but one of those ones that I think, as I said before, falls into the quite technical. And I should also probably put on record, thank you to my colleague Bryony, who along with me in this research has been reading through all the mayoral combined authority constitutions to look at all of their voting requirements, which will
Lucky Bryony,
become slightly redundant knowledge, but I'm sure it'll be useful in the future. So yeah, it's technical. There's a couple of technical changes which actually I think will really change the way that combined authorities make their decisions. The first is the plan to give mayors the call-in powers on planning decisions. So that's similar to the Mayor of London, where they can become the planning authority under certain circumstances. But the other one, as you said, is changes to the voting requirements. So the white paper says that wherever possible, voting requirements should move to a simple majority. So we take this to mean things like spatial development plans, transport plans, and even possibly budgets will no longer require unanimous support of the combined authority board. So that effectively removes the veto power of individual councils. So why are they doing this? So voting requirements requiring unanimous support were initially designed into the model in part to alleviate concerns about like mayoral overreach or executive power and kind of reduce the unpredictability of what a mayoral combined authority model might look like. But the result has been that in several places, not everywhere, but some really important strategic plans have been either delayed or completely dropped due to not being able to get unanimous agreement. And one council being able to veto the plan. So we talk about the GMCA strategic plan. Also in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, there's a transport plan that was delayed as well. And given that what Tom was saying about the whole MO of these places being about growth, not being able to do this kind of work and get agreement on it has really been a problem. So it's interesting to see that they went as far to say that sort of wherever possible we'll be moving to simple majority voting. These reforms, including call-in powers, should help the government to deliver their really rather ambitious plan to roll out regional planning across the country and build their 1.5 million homes in this parliament. But they're also going to help combined authorities be able to get these strategic plans over the line, which is really what they're set up to do, and the way they're resourced to work as well. And I think this is a really important change, but as through our research, decisions rarely actually get to the point of a vote. They rarely actually fall at the voting point. And actually, in the same way, I was thinking about the other day as like cabinet committees, a lot of the work goes on kind of like in the wings behind the scenes to get people to kind of come along with you in the decision making. And mayors aren't going to want to railroad decisions and make their working relationships really awful. They're going to want to still build consensus up to a point. Like no one would want to work in an environment where you didn't want to do that. So the two things that we've identified that are really related to this are capacity, sort of resourcing, but also robust accountability mechanisms that are really going to have to be strengthened in order for this to be implemented well. Matthew can, as an expert, can cover off the accountability stuff, but in terms of capacity, this really means extra analytical and research support so that members of the board can feel certain that the decisions are made on good evidence and robust principles. Also kind of administrative support just to be able to get things like decisions made, papers round to people, all that kind of stuff. And the white paper has some good stuff on capacity, and there's a recognition that capacity is really important. So there's the secondments and the mayoral data council. But in the past, we recommended actually it's important to build up the in-house capacity. So things like doubling the capacity fund, which we haven't seen in this white paper. But I think that's really needed. So it's just about, it's great progress that we're changing the voting requirements. They were kind of like built into the model originally, and I feel like things have changed enough. But thinking about it in the round, that it's not just changing voting requirements that's going to be needed. There's the kind of extra support that is going to be required as well.
Yeah, definitely important. I mean, a lot of the combined authorities are fairly small, fairly new institutions, and as their powers expand, and I think particularly as they take on more flexible funding packages, it's very important for sure. That's, I think, very standard IFG argument that they'll need to have that kind of strategic capacity in-house to take decisions appropriately. But also, as you said, Rebecca, the accountability and scrutiny side needs to be thought about and built up as well. Did you want to come back in on that point specifically, Rebecca? Otherwise, I was going to ask Matthew what he made of the government's plans.
No, sorry, just a really quick point on the capacity thing, in that actually in a lot of places, exactly as you said, that people will borrow staff from local authorities as well. So the relationship remains very important in that it's the way that capacity works at the moment also relies on that, I think, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, Matthew, on the accountability front, what's the government planning and what else should it do?
Well, as the government is expanding powers, it's also going to need to strengthen accountability mechanisms. And the government's recognised this and is saying that it's going to explore a variety of options. One is going to be looking at what's known as local public accounts committees. Now, these are the full details need to actually be ironed out, but these are probably going to be modelled on something not dissimilar to the Public Accounts Committee that operates in Parliament. But I mean, we've made the case that, you know, this needs to have an independent chair, needs to have cross-party representation, a representative membership, and ensure that it has funding that's independent of the body it scrutinises. So we still need to see what government says in this space. But I think the other thing that they brought forward that was welcome from us is a suggestion of the creation of a single point of accountability for value for money. Now, again, there's a parallel to what happens in Westminster, in that you're able to have the person who's responsible for funding then say, sorry, I've completely lost my train of thought there. Basically, what I was going to say is that what we've previously recommended is actually in this space that the chief executive of the combined authority should have these particular powers, and it should accompany a system of mayoral directions, which would ultimately be issued if the combined authority chief executive considers that any spending isn't going to meet feasibility or value for money criteria, but the mayor wants to press on regardless. So those are two of the sort of the big measures that have been announced, but some of the finer details of it, I think we still need to see answered.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that goes across the piece, which is why there's going to be a few months probably of interesting debate about all of these matters. Before we do go to the audience, I feel we do have to say something about the local government reorganisation plans, which, I mean, some people would maybe question whether that's devolution in its own right. It's almost like a whole separate pillar of the white paper. But that the government sees as maybe necessary to simplify the subnational governance landscape. So the idea is there's going to be a single tier of local government across England, and then above that, strategic authorities, so combined authorities basically, in all places as well. So, I mean, on that side, Matthew, I mean, what do we expect precisely to happen now? How fast is this process likely to unfold, and And how do those two agendas intersect in your view, the unitarisation, LGR, local government reorganisation, and the devolution process?
Well, I mean, first, a disclaimer. This is a very big topic and could have been a webinar in itself. I think
Definitely.
the main rundown is, as you've said, there's been announced a program of local government reorganisation to replace all two-tier county and district councils with a single tier of unitary authorities. And it also plans to reorganise existing unitary councils where there is evidence of failure. Or their size or boundaries are limiting public service performance. In terms of what this looks like in terms of timetable, the government's going to write to council leaders to invite proposals and aims to deliver a first wave of reorganisation in this parliament. What the shape of this will look like, new unitary councils will be required to have populations at least 500,000, although there may be some exceptions to that rule. The government has also made plain that individual local authorities will not be eligible for mayoral devolution. So the new unitary authorities will need to join with neighbouring areas to form mayoral strategic authorities. In terms of the intersection with the devolution agenda, taking that thought a little further, I mean, as Rebecca highlighted at the start, in terms of the launch of this white paper, I think this the reorganization has really been a political lightning rod and has drawn a lot of attention about, will we have non-representative supersized unitary authorities and what could be the impact on elections. I think we also need to take a step back to remember that this affects 21 council areas, county council areas, and that's about 29% of England's population. What we've previously suggested in this territory, though, is that unitarisation could actually make it easier for new mayoral strategic authorities and could potentially lead to some more stable institutions. And with the government clear that reorganisation should not delay devolution and plans should be complementary, I think there are some questions about sequencing that are left unanswered. Because is the plan that an area should go for devolution first and then unitarise secondly, or should it be the other way around? I think these are things that might be decided at a local level, but I think there's scope for greater steer there. In terms of the places that I'm going to be keeping an eye out for, all we know so far is what's been reported in the press, and there were some articles out in the run-up to the white paper that suggested that in the first wave we might see Suffolk, Norfolk, Kent, Essex, Hertfordshire and Surrey in this first wave, but we'll have to wait and see in that space, I think.
Absolutely. And as you said, not only this could be a webinar in its own right, it might well be an event in its own right in the new year. One for us to discuss and finalise maybe later today. Yeah, moving on to audience questions now. Thank you for everyone who submitted and people who voted, which helps me actually to see what is on people's minds. So, Tom, there's been a couple of questions, related ones actually, on fiscal devolution. So I'll just combine them. They're fairly similar anyway. So one is from an anonymous person who asks, to what extent do you think the lack of fiscal devolution in the government's plans will influence the success of decentralisation? And then relatedly from Martin Wheatley, he asks, are the aspirations in the white paper achievable without fiscal devolution? And what can be done to overcome reported Treasury opposition, which is maybe the trickier aspect of that. But yeah, over to you, Tom, and then Rebecca, you may have thoughts on that as well. Go for it.
I think fiscal devolution is the bit that's sort of obviously missing from this agenda and from this white paper. There's a little bit more flexibility over how mayors can use their council tax precept. There's the ability for them to raise a community infrastructure levy to help with some development. But really there's, combined authorities will still be getting a big chunk of their money sort of as grants from Whitehall, more flexible grants, but grants from Whitehall rather than raising their own revenue. And if we look at how other countries tend to operate, if we think about where we might want to get to in the long term, I think that there are two aspects that make more fiscal devolution kind of really important. I think the biggest one is just around sort of how local accountability works and the kind of status of mayors as people who both raise the money and then spend it. And I think that in terms of local accountability, in terms of their sort of responsibility and their relationship with Whitehall as well is really important. I think while they're entirely dependent on Whitehall for their funding, it's much harder for them to have both the certainty about how much funding they'll have in future, but also even that agency, that they're almost, this is the sense almost in which that it might feel like more like decentralization than devolution, because they're sort of spending Whitehall's money. That's how it might look and how Whitehall might think about it, rather than spending their own local money. I think it was a bit disappointing that we didn't even see sort of modest moves to allow mayors to raise some small bits of extra money, like tourist taxes and so on, that wouldn't be a game changer, but would at least start to set the principle that mayors can raise these revenue streams that Whitehall has no interest in raising themselves. How do you overcome the opposition? Partly, I think it's mayors proving that they can deliver well, and as integrated settlements come down the line and they have more flexibility, delivering well on that will increase confidence. And I think the Treasury has actually been fairly in favour of that additional flexibility for spending, but just not going as far as tax. What I would say as well is that the integrated settlement creates an opportunity or a basis on which you could do further fiscal devolution as well. If you look at what happened in Scotland and Wales, the way that devolution of tax revenues happened was sort of replacing a chunk of the block grant Barnett formula with some tax revenues. And the integrated settlement, certainly if it grows over time, becomes that sort of block grant, or could become that block grant for combined authorities. So I think that's the route forward, but we're not going to see much in this Parliament, I think.
No, and it's interesting whether this is actually not happening due to sort of Treasury institutional resistance, or is this more of a political judgment by Labour, the Chancellor? This is how it was reported last week, wasn't it? That the Chancellor doesn't want to give any more, put any more fuel to the fire of the idea that this is a tax raising, typical Labour tax and spend kind of government. We don't have to get into that now, but I just point that out. It may not be all the Treasury's fault, as people like to assume. Let's Rebecca, if you've got thoughts on that, do bring those up in a moment. But I think I'll throw a couple other questions onto the table from the audience now, and then any of you can pick them up. So the top ranked question of all is from Duncan Henderson, who I believe I know which Duncan Henderson that is, an ex-IFG colleague. Hello, Duncan, if that is indeed you. He asks, how much are other key departments signed up to the agenda and the desire to devolve powers? And is there potential for interdepartmental tensions as the government tries to implement these proposals? So I think that is a very interesting and important aspect of this, that on paper this is quite a broad multi-departmental agenda, but typically maybe different bits of Whitehall are more or less convinced of it. So that's the first question. Second one, again from someone else anonymous, the lack of delivery timetables in the white paper is troubling. Does the panel think this may mean that areas like the Southwest with no MCAs, but could apply to other places, no doubt as well, risk getting left behind? So I think there's just an interesting point generally about timetables that we expect. And then the third one, on a slightly different theme, has the alignment of MCA boundaries, this is from Robert Pickersgill, has alignment of MCA boundaries with NHS, ICS, integrated care system boundaries been considered adequately? Because this is important for the integration of social care and healthcare provision with other things like planning and transport for routes for patients to get to hospital, for example. But so 3 interesting questions there. Rebecca, take your pick.
Great. I'll take the first one, and I'm going to take it in relation to the funding stuff we haven't really talked about yet, but that Tom and I wrote a paper on earlier in the year, which is mainly linked to sort of local growth funding, but applies across the board, kind of like the funding pots that local authorities, command authorities receive from the government. And one of the key things here is actually, there's an element of what MHCLG can do some of the funding comes from them and some of it is funneled through them, but actually they're not the worst offender when it comes to the proliferation of small restrictive funding pots that come out of central government. Other departments are very responsible for that as well. And so the last government had what was called the funding simplification doctrine. This government has, in this white paper, has set out quite a sensible, like tiered approach to how you consolidate funding for those kind of pots at different levels. For the foundation combined authorities, foundation strategic authorities, that's MHCRG funding. So they're in control of that. But as you go sort of up the ladder, their other departments will be responsible for some of this money. So getting that sign off, I think, is really important. And what hasn't come out yet is exactly how that mechanism will work. Treasury is going to be part of that. So the way that the Treasury kind of like asks places to kind of when they're setting up new funds, like, have you thought about the fact this doesn't need to be competitive? Have you thought about how this links in with other funds? That's going to be really important. But buy-in from departments like Department of Transport, Education, that have a lot of those kind of like funding pots will really matter. And I think, yeah, just the mechanism for how that will work isn't really clear yet, but I think is going to be really important.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I mean, I think it's interesting, isn't it, which departments, just reading between the lines, appear to be moving faster and maybe have shifted to some extent. I mean, we haven't talked about it so much, but the employment support devolution commitments, I think, are quite important. I know they're seen as such by the metro mayors and so on. And that's generally seen as DWP, the responsible department, has sort of historically been seen as a bit resistant to devolution. Maybe that's changed a bit, it feels like, under the current Secretary of State. There's also, as Tom said before, been that change on the retrofit budget, so that's going to be devolved more rapidly. Feels like a bit of a change on DESNE's side. Education's quite interesting, going all in for adult skills education, but still quite cautious on 16 to 19. And there's much more of a view, I think, in that part of the Department of Education, it seems, that you need to maintain more national provision and ensure that all young learners have the same rights and entitlements. So I think you can start to pick up some of those interesting differences. Health maybe going a bit less quickly than it might as well, although that may also be due to lack of appetite among mayors and so on. Anyway, those are just some thoughts from my side. Matthew, any thoughts from you? There was that question about implementation, delivery timetables, and whether places are at risk of getting left behind.
I was going to have give you an answer on that one, but then move on to the boundaries as well. So I think
please do.
The timetables question is interesting because obviously a lot of this will depend on when the bill actually comes forward and then turns into the act. So some of the mechanisms that they've outlined that will really help to shape some of these conversations will be affected by when these powers come into force. So, for example, there's the ministerial directive power that the government's going for, which will allow it to actually, for areas, it wants to use it in exceptional circumstances, but in areas where there is no common agreement on what a local combined authority could look like, strategic authority could look like, the ministers will actually have the ability to potentially impose it. Another thing I think that we have to bear in mind is that they haven't yet outlined the exact mechanism for the local government reorganisation, and that interacts in many areas with the devolution timetables. And as we sort of discussed a bit earlier, actually sequencing that will be a challenge, or will need to be worked through at a local area. So I think it's a bit difficult to put a firm date at this stage. And I think that once we're clear on parliamentary timetable and the mechanisms for going about local government reorganisation, that will help to fill in some of those blanks. On the boundaries question, though, I think the credit where credit's due, the government, when it wants to specify when local areas are coming forward with their geographies and saying this is what we think we want to have for our strategic authority, they have recognised the need for alignment with public service boundaries. And I think that one of the challenges when you go into the NHS is there are some trusts and boards that spread over quite complex geographies, and it will be quite difficult to fully align in all of these areas. But I think, like I say, credit where credit's due, they have done it, and they are they've made clear that they are going to try and factor these things into the decision making. And certainly when, as you'll recall, Akash, when we were pulling together the Completing the Map report and trying to compare those boundaries and for the suggestions that we made for the two options for facing local areas, in many cases it was really quite tricky to align all of those public services. So there may, in certain circumstances, be trade-offs, but that'll be very much a conversation that needs to happen in those local areas and in conjunction with government.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We looked into the multiplicity of different administrative geographies used by public services, the more complicated it got. And yeah, finding a geography that works for all services and as well as economic geography and identity and so on is virtually impossible in most places. So there are obviously those trade-offs to be made, as you've argued there, Matthew. There's also questions here. I think I'll put these to the panel as well. Tom, if you want to come back on any of that, please do so in a moment as well. But one question on local elections in both 2025, 2026, given all the reorganization that's going to be taking place, the merging of, well, the abolition of districts, changes to some unitary authorities and so on, what do we think is going to happen with local elections? So, I mean, Matthew, you might take that in a sec. There's also a question, not sure if anyone here has strong views on it. We have a colleague, Millie, who's more expert on this, but question about what are the implications for London? There are some there's a little interesting section, I think, in the white paper on London specifically. Yeah, I mean, maybe Tom or Rebecca might have thoughts on that. And then let's see which other one I might take here. Well, there's a question about the scale I think is quite interesting. Well, the specific question here, again, from a non-person, is I note the proposed population size for new unitary authorities is a minimum of 500,000. So is the implication the government is now more open to larger county unitaries than previously trailed? I mean, that's quite a specific question. I think that's just an interesting question about what do we think of the right scale for both local government unitaries, as it'll be, and strategic authorities as well. So, Tom, do you want to go first on any of that?
Sure, I will do my best on that London question. London does sit in a really interesting position in this agenda because through the GLA had devolution long before all of these other city regions, but on a very different basis, with the Assembly and with the Mayor actually having quite a different set of powers. And really, until you got to the trailblazer deals to Greater Manchester and the West Midlands, pretty much everything that places outside London were getting, the London Mayor already had. But that isn't true anymore with things like integrated settlement. And because London is operating on a kind of different constitutional basis, if you like, some of the things that are going to be available for other established authorities are quite easy to provide for London. Other things are more difficult. And I think what the government has effectively said in the paper is we're not going to revisit the London constitutional settlement, but we're going to try to make it work, if you like. And it's quite an interesting change of dynamic because really the discussions about devolution under the last government, it was very explicitly around levelling up, not about London. And really there was very little discussion of London at all. You now have a Labour government, of course, with the Labour mayor, who is a Labour politician with that gets the most votes of anyone in the whole in the whole country for them directly. And so there's much more consideration of how to incorporate London and ensure that kind of London doesn't get left behind on the revolution, if you like. That it wouldn't really make any sense for, in many ways, the most established authority to not get the powers of everywhere else just because it has a slightly different setup. So it's a bit of a hodgepodge, but I think it's great that London is not being ignored as part of this agenda.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think not having it open in front of me, but there's some kind of commitment, isn't there, to looking into how an integrated settlement type model could work for London, where the complication is, as you were alluding to, there's no combined authority. So there's GLA functions, there's London Council's functions. So what would be the entity that would take responsibility for a integrated settlement type block? A bit different. I thought the other interesting thing was there's a sort of commitment to benchmarking, not just against your Greater Manchesters, but to global cities as well. I think I'm sure that's something that the GLA and the mayor himself probably are really keen to push, that idea that sure, there's things one could learn from Greater Manchester and devolution elsewhere in England, but New York, Paris, wherever, like those are the actual peers that London, maybe in its some might say slightly arrogant way, like that's the kind of group that they look to. But yeah, so that's very interesting. Rebecca, do you have thoughts on any of those questions? There's also another question that someone has put to us, and I was intending to ask you something similar anyway, which is, what do you think will be the implications or the significance of putting some of this stuff, like the devolution framework in particular, into primary legislation for the first time? So there was that, and then there was the question about local elections. Maybe I'll put to you, Matthew, in a sec. And there was one other that I've now forgotten. Apologies.
I'll take the legislation bit, and then I think Matthew is the expert in the other areas. So
yeah,
I'll do that one. I think this is really interesting in that we've said before that obviously there's a weaker devolution arrangement for England in that it isn't in primary legislation. See, primary legislation not being the be all and end all of everything, but I think it is a really interesting and a good step. It's not only that it puts the devolution framework and the powers and everything else there, but also setting up the ratchet mechanism in that the Secretary of State can add new powers to those tiers and not take them away. So that's really quite an interesting bit of progress that we've seen there. And there's also this sort of devolve and explain principle, which Akash, I know you've written about before, and we were really keen to we call it devolve and explain principle, that we've seen in there, meaning that places can make a formal request to take on additional powers and then receive a sort of reasonable response from the minister for that. In terms of impact, I think the first thing is just it sends a really strong signal that Labour is sticking to its manifesto promise, that it's going to transfer power from Westminster to devolved and local leaders. A lot of this is really about cementing strategic authorities as a tier of government that is going to be here for the long haul. Like even just changing the terminology to strategic authority or the established strategic authority away from sort of the trailblazer, which in a way doesn't feel kind of as like cemented. I think it's just interesting to see that signal. But also in practice, this will support the ability for mayors to work in partnership more with central government. So in a ideally equal footing is the idea of where we're trying to aim to get to. And really that's just about empowering mayors to be able to sort of go to central government, like be part of the governance framework, and also shifting the outlook from government. We talked about trying to get all different departments on board, shifting that outlook from Westminster outwards towards local places and actually what these places can do and what they're there for. I think those are two really significant things that you get from putting this into primary legislation.
Yeah, thanks very much. And yeah, we don't have time to talk about it now, but all that stuff about partnership working between central government and mayors, strategic authorities, I think that's very interesting. And the Council of Nations and Regions, the Mayoral Council, and so on, we'll see over time exactly what functions they take on. But the government does seem to be serious about working in partnership in a slightly different way to its predecessors, I think. So we are almost out of time. Matthew, final word to you. We had those two questions, one about impact on local elections and timings of those, and then one about scale of local and devolved governments.
Yeah, so briefly on local elections, Jim McMahon did the interview rounds when the white paper was being launched, and there's a lot of concern and questions about are elections going to be cancelled. What he said at the time was that they will be going ahead, but for those areas that will be that have put their names forward to going through reorganisation, it's possible that they may be pushed back because ultimately you need to be electing to what will be the future government in that local area rather than the one that's about to be abolished, if I recall correctly. But the government did release a press release on this to clarify this. So to look into the real technical details of it, I recommend going to the MHCLG pages. In terms of the question of scale, I think it is interesting because if setting a threshold at 500,000 for unitarisation, I believe that's only 6 out of the 21 county council areas actually have populations above 1 million, which means that actually for most of them, you're looking at potentially unitary authorities greater than 500,000 and less than 1 million. And the typical average size for a unitary authority at the moment is about the 230,000 mark, whereas the typical county council size is about the 830,000 mark. So it does imply that we are going to potentially look to more Buckinghamshire style devolutions that are on that county council footprint.
Okay, great. No, that's really helpful. Okay, well, thank you. I'm sure we could have gone on a lot longer. Certainly, we have other questions. Apologies to people who've posed them that we cannot take. But yeah, thank you to the audience for joining us. Many thanks to Tom, Rebecca, and Matthew for what I found to be really interesting, enlightening conversation. IFG will be doing lots more work on all of this stuff. I'm sure for many more years to come. So watch this space, and yeah, thanks for joining us.